At its core, Annihilation is a film about grief. Annihilation is a film centered around an alien phenomenon known only as the Shimmer. The origins of this entity are entirely unknown, and collecting data on the Shimmer has been so far impossible as no one has returned upon entering it. Whilst on the surface, Annihilation presents itself as a science fiction film, the focus of this adaptation lies with the guilt each character feels and how they deal with this self-destructive feeling. The ways in which these characters approach and face their own grief demonstrates the choices we as humans make to overcome or self-destruct in the face of such a powerful emotion. This is an idea that binds the 5 protagonists of Annihilation to the suicidal mission they volunteer to embark on. As a result, 3 main themes stand out: mutation, self-destruction, and acceptance. It is through these ideas that we are able to understand the process of grief and the often painful steps necessary to overcome it. The first of our 3 themes demonstrates how grief can take unnatural and often monstrous forms. This is evident through the hostile wildlife the group encounters whilst in the Shimmer. One example we see of how grief can become monstrous is through the terrifying mutated bear that possesses the ability to mimic the dying sounds of its victims. We see this when it imitates the voice of Shepard, who was found dead in a previous scene. The implication of this creature is best described by Josie, who tells Lena, "I think as she was dying, part of her mind became part of the creature that was killing her." Imagine dying frightened and in pain and having that as the only part of you that survives. What Josie is alluding to here is that Shepard dies unable to accept her own grief, and as such is mocked by the mutant bear which mimics only her traumatic emotions. As a result, she dies frightened and in pain, never able to accept her own trauma or come to terms with the grief it caused her. Another way in which mutation is clear in Annihilation is through the significance of cancer. Cancer plays an important role in the narrative. From the beginning, when Lena leads a class on the topic of rogue cells in a tumour, to the realisation that Dr. Ventress entered the Shimmer because of her cancer. Cancer, like grief, represents misfortune that is out of our control. It could afflict any one of us at any time in our lives, no matter the circumstances. Here, Annihilation highlights the fragility of life, but also stresses how important it is to enjoy our existence whilst we are still alive. Cancer also represents another one of our 3 themes, that being self-destruction. Self-destruction is perhaps the most important theme in understanding the motivations of the protagonists in Annihilation. This idea of self-destruction refers to intentional behaviour that causes harm to oneself. The act of exploring the Shimmer can be seen as self-destructive, as all of the team were aware of the risks but chose to pursue this mission regardless. This is a sentiment echoed by Shepard, who tells Lena, "Guess there had to be something," in response to Lena telling her of her husband's passing. The implication here is that the group is motivated by their common self-destructive actions, motivated by their own grief. Lena's self-destructive actions are perhaps the most clear during Annihilation, as we realise the true reason for her grief lies in the guilt she feels over her husband's death. Lena feels personally responsible for his death, as her affair with a colleague pushed Kane to his own self-destructive action by accepting a mission into the Shimmer. Her unwillingness to forgive herself is seen through the use of flashbacks about her affair, which serve as constant reminders to Lena of her guilt. This leads to a neglect of her own well-being, an idea supported by the copy of her house overgrown with nature and clearly neglected in the Shimmer. This image represents Lena's unwillingness to move on, and her personal life, represented by her neglected house, signifies how grief has frozen her ability to live. The final theme to consider when analysing grief in Annihilation is acceptance. Acceptance is seen in the climax of the film, when Lena confronts the epicentre of the Shimmer in the lighthouse. Upon entering the lighthouse, Lena is confronted with a charred skeleton, and after watching footage from a camera recorder, she learns of the fate of her husband Kane. Seemingly unable to cope with the changes that grief has brought to him, Kane proceeds with the ultimate act of self-destruction and commits suicide. His reasons for this, he explains, are, "My flesh moves like liquid, my mind cut loose, I can't bear it." The betrayal of his wife Lena has caused Kane immense grief, and he is unable to come to terms with the changes this action represents. His moving flesh and liquid mind demonstrate the fluidity of his emotions, and he is unable to bear his changing feelings. In his place, he informs his clone to find Lena, an act he himself is not strong enough to undertake. Confronted with either the acceptance of his trauma or self-destruction, Kane makes his decision and commits suicide. Lena also finds herself confronted with her own clone. The alien being initially represents a sexless, faceless form, likely an imitation of the shell Lena has become since the disappearance of Kane. Upon facing this imitation, her first instinct is to flee the spectre. However, the being moves faster than her and pins her up against the lighthouse door. As Lena struggles against the imitation, it slowly begins to suffocate her through its heavy weight and attempts to merge with her. It is only after Lena stops struggling that the being releases his grip and the two fall to the floor in perfect synchronization. This act of acceptance prevents Lena's grief from suffocating her and consuming her entirely. Upon waking up, the two move in perfect coordination and Lena seemingly begins to understand the being. She reaches into Kane's bag and produces a phosphorus grenade, the same used by Kane to commit suicide, and holds hands with the alien. This action causes the spectre to morph into Lena's image, and she pulls the pin on the grenade, leaving the clone to catch fire as she escapes the lighthouse. Evidently, the clone represents the version of Lena unable to cope with the change presented by her own grief. As the copy is unable to accept its own actions, it is left with no choice but to self-destruct, akin to Kane's own realization. It is only through the Shimmer that Lena is able to forgive herself and come to terms with her own grief. As her cells have literally mutated through her exposure to the Shimmer, she now has the ability to approach her grief from a different perspective and finally move on from this self-destructive path. We see this evidence of change in the final scene when she responds to Kane's clone's question of "Are you Lena?" with a trembling breath. The implication of this being that Lena has moved on from her previous self. We see evidence of this in the closing scene when her eyes rapidly change colours. This is an indication that the Shimmer, representing Lena's change, remains with her. As a result, we see how Annihilation represents grief as a choice to adapt to change or self-destruct if we refuse to accept our trauma.
At the empty place inside, heartlessly helping himself to her bad dreams. He worries, did he hear a goodbye?